Hi, I'm Lucy Steigerwald for Liberty.me, and this is Politics for People Who Hate Politics, and we're going to do a little chat about the po-pos, that is to say, the police. And my guest today, pardon me as I fiddle with my audio and try to make things work, but they never ever do. Oh, Lord. Okay. You know what? Today we have our lovely guests. We have Michael Tracy, who is a reporter, and he has written for some quality publications like Vice, Reason, The American Conservative, and The Nation, and some less quality publications like Salon. um, we have Justin Glah, who is a roving reporter person as well. I feel like Michael Tracy uses that term sometimes. And Justin has written for Vice, and he has done some Daily Beast stuff lately, particularly on the and about the big old mess in Ferguson. And I'm going to ask him about that. And we have at least the audio, I'm hoping, of Ed Krajewski. I can do it. I can do it. Steigerwald's been butchered enough that I should be able to do that. And Ed is an associate editor for Reason 24/7 News, and he has done a lot of awesome stuff about the cops in the past 2 years or so. So welcome, gents. Thanks for coming.
Thanks. I think I'm here.
I believe you are as well. I think you're all here.
I like the fact that
Okay.
it's just a disembodied voice.
Yeah, we did that on the Paranoia podcast with Franklin Harris, and it kind of added to the atmosphere. It's not really as relevant here, sadly, but we'll work with it. There's an echo. This technical thing is driving me crazy today. I'm out of Hangouts practice here. All right, let's start with a little bit. Justin, I know you actually went down to Ferguson, and you wrote that up for the Daily Beast. Can you tell us what that was like for a minute or so? Just like, I don't know. Can you set the scene?
Yeah, it was totally surreal. I like the first night I got down there, I got there at the moment when it like popped off and cops were shooting tear gas canisters and rubber bullets, and it was just like really surreal to be in that environment and to think like this is a suburb of a Midwestern city or something like that. So it was just very strange to be there and to like witness all of that happening.
Had you done any? I mean, you had done a Vice thing about the SWAT raid over the Twitter account of the Noria, but had you, which wasn't amazing and really disturbing, but also funny, but also mostly disturbing. Had you done like? Had you seen kind of what police can look like in America today before you got to Ferguson? Like, had you seen anything like that before?
Yeah, I mean, I've done crime reporting for two, like small and mid-market newspapers since like summer of 2011. So I mean, I've been on like standoff scenes. One particular one that lasted like 6 hours for this paper that I worked at up in northern Minnesota. So, like, I've seen cops in battle gear, like, in camouflage with sniper rifles and MRAPs and all of that stuff. So it wasn't anything that was, like, super bizarre. It was just the level to which they had taken it and the amount, I guess. Like, it's one thing when the stand-up situation in northern Minnesota was one thing where the guy's got, like, a high-powered rifle and he's clearly, like, presenting a danger to the community around him. And that's why they responded with the level of force that they did. But Ferguson was different in that the people were like armed with like water bottles, and they were responding with M14s and MRAPs. So
right, and if the body armor is not to protect you from water bottles being thrown at you, I'm not sure what it's for at all.
Right. Yeah.
I guess in general, we can ask the rest of you two as well. Ferguson kind of made you guys, all three of you, might have done some stuff about cops being absurd before Ferguson, but it definitely seemed like Ferguson all of a sudden, the mainstream media at large discovered, oh my God, cops. Cops are a thing. I mean, you would turn on MSNBC in particular, and they were covering this for hours, for days, on like a week there, I guess. Can we talk about the fact that this, and obviously it's leveled off since then, and it's not as, it's not suddenly like the big story, thanks Middle Eastern shenanigans, but it's still like, do you think that it did some good in just getting more people to pay attention to like what the hell are the cops doing?
Yeah, so I want to make a point about this because I covered Occupy quite extensively, as you probably recall, in New York in particular, but elsewhere. And so, I feel like a lot of the groundwork, and I'm not setting Occupy as an arbitrary starting point for this, but I feel like a lot of the precedent in the terms of the police response to Occupy kind of contributed to what we saw manifest in Ferguson. In that, first of all, there was in New York, the police arrested journalists indiscriminately and suffered no consequences for it, despite like all the major newspapers and media outlets in the city authoring a letter to the NYPD in like really stern terms denouncing their conduct. So like even the New York Post was in on that letter, and there was never any accountability for it whatsoever. And of course, I'm not drawing a direct link between the NYPD conduct and the conduct in a suburb of St. Louis, but like it kind of contributes to the general zeitgeist of police just acting with total impunity. But I think the good that came out of Ferguson came from like the people, generally the right-wing media despised Occupy, despite my best attempts to convince them that there were like libertarians involved and constitutionalists involved and so forth. And I goaded Ron Paul into supporting
Ron
it.
Paul was good on it. He started to try to reach out.
I was the first one to interview him about it.
Were you really?
Yeah, I'll send you the link. I interviewed him for a reason about it.
I legitimately do not remember that, which is really weird. I must have.
I'll send it to you.
Okay, yeah. I want to see that.
But so like the right-wing media complex despised Occupy, if you can recall. They did like rape slur. They like made up rape allegations about.
Dude, I stood a foot from Andrew Breitbart as he screamed at Occupy DC, "Stop raping people."
Yeah, exactly. All that kind of stuff. But they couldn't really do that for the Ferguson protest because the grievance was so blindingly obvious, because it was largely black, meaning that there was more historic, like they couldn't dismiss it as like trust fund white hipsters.
Right. But they couldn't dismiss it as looters.
That drew their attention to the overblown police response a little more forcefully, such that it couldn't be dismissed as this kind of willy-nilly idiot protest block that showed up. So I think that is why the media response kind of manifested in the way it did, and MSNBC covered it a lot because they catered to African Americans, frankly, and
they were very good at it.
Yeah, it's a large segment of their viewership, and
I forgot how non-awful MSNBC can be. Actually, when I saw them covering, I was like, "Oh yeah, you actually aren't an awful network sometimes."
No, Chris Hayes did a fantastic job covering it, as he usually
does. He did, yeah.
What was disturbing about it? I mean, Mike, I think you're right that they weren't that certain people with certain political views weren't able to like attach any kind of politics to the protesters in Ferguson, but they attached lots of other things to them. Lucy said something about, they just mentioned the looting more, which was something that was kind of
stress that.
Yeah, that was kind of like, I can't remember who was asking me about it, but I think I maybe went on somewhere where they were asking me about, it was probably Fox News, and I went on there and they were asking me about the looting, and I was like, look, this is kind of blown out of proportion. There was one night of looting. Yes, there was a gas station that was burned to the ground. Another business was really looted, but I mean it was pretty much contained to one night. But then that was the for the naysayers, for the people who were saying, oh, screw these protesters, they're just like taking advantage of the situation. That was kind of like their clarion call that they used over and over again. Well, they're looting and they're rioting and they're causing unrest and they're causing these violent clashes with police. And that was another thing that became something that people were bringing up over and over again, was these violent clashes with police. And I don't think that, first off, I mean, I was there every single night except for one night where there was, tear gas and all that going back and forth. And it was very difficult each time to determine what exactly set it off. Like, it's not like there was one moment where a protester, like, threw a rock and then the cops are like, okay, we're gonna get you guys out of here now. It was very difficult to tell each time. It could have been the cops sometimes. Sometimes it was the protesters throwing, like, bottles of water at the cops, and then what would happen every single night was the cops would say, you need to go home or what they would always say was face like arrest or other consequences. And people would always be like, what are the other consequences? And they would scream this at them. And then the other consequences were clearly, we're going to fire tear gas and rubber bullets at you. So, I mean, while they weren't able to necessarily attach, like, the politics to these protesters, they did have their other means of kind of like marginalizing what their goals were and what they were calling for.
Yeah, but I think everything, I agree with all of what you said, and obviously you were on the ground, so I defer to you in terms of the firsthand reporting. But I think the looting charges and the kind of trumping up the violence was definitely a vocal strain of the right-wing reaction, but not as unanimous as it might have been if, say, the protest had been organized by white hipsters and some black people joined up.
Right.
Just
like,
in general, more of the right and more of the mainstream, more of the non-radical or non-right type people were more sympathetic than they have been in the past. I mean,
even Breitbart people were saying, "Whoa, what is this tank showing up?" And so it was, and whereas if it was like Occupy radical anarchists or something, they would have cheered the tanks coming into town.
Yeah.
I also want to make the quick point that Obama himself fostered the impression that looting was a major aspect of this, because I don't know if you recall this, but his first statement on the subject, he didn't denounce the police, of course, but he made a point to denounce the looters. So it wasn't just the right-wing media doing this.
Do you expect him to denounce the police?
No, but I would expect him to not trump up bogus looting allegations.
Would you? I don't know that I would.
Well, I mean, I wouldn't expect it. I would hope he would do it, especially his most reliable constituency is black voters, and he basically abused them all the way through and flew to Martha's Vineyard and played golf while the National Guard, under whose command, which he commands, were in the city helping police curtail civil liberties.
That sounds about right.
Yeah, it was bizarre to me, and it was also something that, like, from the very first day there, was a point of kind of soreness for the people there. And they were like, like every time I would ask a question about that, where I was just trying to like cover both sides of it and say like, what do you think about this? I mean, people would get really upset because their whole thing the entire time is like, who cares about the looting? Who cares about the clashes with police? We're here because we feel that Mike Brown was killed unjustly by the cops, so none of this other stuff should matter. Any media or government officials or police officials who are coming in here and bringing up this other stuff, they're diluting the message that we're trying to send out. So that was something that was like super frustrating for them.
I mean, the thing with the looting is that I don't know why it's so hard, especially for, maybe the more right constitutionalist-y type people to say, yeah, because a couple of people have been violent or a couple of people have burned some poor bastard's store down or gas station. Like, is that supposed to violate the right to assembly for every single person in an entire area? I mean,
or
that's not
supposed to. Is that somehow a justification for not caring about the death of Mike Brown or the very, I think, in some cases, reasonable questions that these people were asking? I think is the larger point.
And why is anyone further surprised that young men, some of whom had drunk alcohol, according to some of the tweets that I remember seeing, and who were really angry and joining up with one another. Any men, young men, like between 16 and 23, gathering at night and upset and like firing each other up, are probably going to cause some problems, regardless of race. So why is that treated as this like shocking development?
Yeah, I don't know.
Oh, now there's a pause, of course.
We've got Ed back.
Ed and his endless technical difficulties. He can now see us, but he can't hear us.
All right, well, let's just press on at this point.
I think that's the thing to do. I had a bunch of comments I was going to make in response to. Well, the Occupy thing. I guess since I'm the host here, I can try to speak to the things that I saw myself. I mean, it started long before Occupy, though, Tracy.
I know. That's why I said that I'm not setting Occupy as an arbitrary starting point.
But no, I realize that, but you're still referring back to it in a way.
So what?
Can you let me get to a point that I'm trying to struggle towards?
Sorry, go ahead.
Random hostile person. I guess. I mean, Occupy was. I think it's like I don't want to put down Occupy en masse. I think that it was an interesting thing. I think that they got a lot of shit from the right wingers and a lot of exaggerations. They're all raping everyone, and it was terrible. But I think it bodes well that in mostly a black community, people outraged about the death of a young black man. That is that's the sympathetic thing. I mean, that bodes really well. That it's not. That gained enough ground in even like National Review type, or as you say, Breitbart. I missed that. I mean, because there is this element of like, but there was still this element that, and we don't know. We still don't know what happened.
By the way, did you realize that a Breitbart reporter was arrested? Kerry Pickett. This was barely reported, but
that's
like,
right. I saw that on Twitter.
The night that I think it was the night before Ryan Devereaux got arrested, or maybe it was that same night. I can't recall precisely. But a Breitbart news reporter, Kerry Pickett, and she's a woman, got arrested unjustly. And I remember asking like this guy from Red State, Ben Howe, like, do you guys care that a reporter from your flagship website got arrested?
That's right.
I
remember. Yeah.
Well, no. I mean, we don't make a big deal about it, blah, blah, blah. I'm like, okay. I mean, there was no mention of that arrest on Breitbart anywhere.
Was she arrested and detained, or arrested and immediately released? Because there were quite a few reporters and photographers who were, arrested technically, but not taken into jail, and were basically released after they showed their media credentials, and then the cops were like, okay, we'll go ahead and let you go now. That happened to several people that I had heard when I was there.
I think she probably was not taken to jail. I'm not 100% sure. I know she was placed under arrest and was in police custody for a couple hours.
Well, and here's the thing, like that doesn't really surprise me, considering the methods that police were using to kind of. And here's the thing, they did a really poor job from the beginning of controlling the message. So what that then turned into was controlling the media, which is where they were preventing media from going into certain areas of the protest zone. Even the first night that I was there, I tried to go down to the memorial where Mike Brown was shot and killed, and it was like after midnight, and I was just point blank told by the cops, you can't go down there. So this is a public street. It's a public place, and they were just like, nope, you can't go there. And then, as it went on, and maybe about a week after that, the cops had established, this protest zone had been established, and then they had said to the media, okay, here's where you're allowed to be, and they were telling them, if you go outside of this area after, there was one night where they had instituted a curfew. If you go outside of it after the curfew, then you're going to be subject to arrest or other action, or removal or other action, which basically meant arrest. So they were controlling where the media were allowed to be. I was there. I tried to go down to the memorial, control where, like what they were able to report.
Whoa, guys, I'm getting some crazy audio thing right now.
the public's...
I cannot hear Justin at this time.
Can you hear me now?
Okay, it's
I
good
totally
now.
just turned off Ed because his audio finally...
There was some like...
It all went to hell. That was fantastic.
Yeah, you have to
Sorry
get
about
rid of
that,
Ed at this
Justin.
point. You have to just get rid of Ed at this point.
Yeah.
Anyway, so what was happening was that there was two groups of reporters. There were the ones who were like, okay, we're going to stay in the media area where you're saying we're allowed to be, and then there was the other group who were like, no, because that's not where anything is happening. We're not able to report on anything unless where we're technically not allowed to be. So that was just another situation that was bizarre to witness, is cops saying, like, you are allowed here but not here, despite the fact that, like, this isn't a state of martial law. I mean, this is still just an American suburb at this point, but they were controlling it like it was basically a war zone.
Yeah, that's how Ryan Devereaux from The Intercept got arrested, and he's a personal friend of mine. I reported with him extensively on Occupy New York, and one reason why he's such a good journalist is because he doesn't listen to like police dictates and actually goes to where the news is. And of course they found that bothersome.
Right, and
locked him up.
That's another. I felt like some of the people from National Review, for example, who were a little more sensible. There was like this initial sympathy, and then when things got too complicated, they kind of walked it back, which I've seen before. Sure, you can criticize the police and all that, but then you have these reporters who don't listen to police orders. You have crowds of people, a handful of whom are throwing bottles, and they also didn't obey orders. There's this fear that when it gets complicated, when you have a large group of people and you have a lot of people who are upset about something, and they can't quite be as sympathetic as they were in theory. That yes, the police are out of line sometimes.
Yeah, like A.J. Delgado, for example, who wrote that amazing National Review piece that blew my mind when I read it, basically ripping police to shreds. Even she, like when the tension's picking up, and it was like very, very volatile, she would kind of just instinctively side with police and like basically blame them.
It's instinctual. It really is. There's this. I think that's exactly the word for it.
And why didn't you guys just get out of the McDonald's when you were ordered to do so for no reason? Like a reporter sitting in a McDonald's during business hours working, and they're supposed to just meekly submit to the officer's demands. Or else they're like a bad citizen.
Well, I think that the instinctual not questioning of police is something that I've noticed just in my time in reporting on crime and police matters. I remember after reporting on that standoff that I was discussing with you guys earlier up in northern Minnesota, that there was quite a few people who were upset with me for releasing the officer's name. And that wasn't even something that I pushed. That was released by the authorities. And they said, this is the guy, he's been put on paid administrative leave. And then there was all of this blowback and this like huge community discussion that took place afterwards. And I remember this one woman writing in and saying, it used to be that that police officers and law enforcement agencies, they were questioned as members of the status quo, and she was obviously referring back to the 60s, and where now it seems like, especially after 9/11, I think, that law enforcement, members of law enforcement agencies are kind of given this automatic go-ahead where if they say something needed to happen, or they're kind of just automatically assumed as being in the right for whatever it is that they do. And I think that like has been going that way since the 60s kind of faded, and then like after 9/11 it really ramped up. We're to the point now where like you hear this all the time, like every cop ever is just like automatically a hero in a lot of people's minds for whatever, just for being a cop. And, that's something that is bothersome to me.
That is bothersome. And I wrote my senior thesis on the communications. Good choice, me. It was mostly about Waco and some other kind of issues like that. Yeah, I know. Shut up, Tracy. But it was about the way the media covered it, and it was totally fascinating to look back on it. And Ruby Ridge was the same way.
No, I agree.
I was diving in the right-wing seas. But the way that the media, to a large extent, covered this kind of event, particularly Waco, was very disturbing because they treated, the federal authorities, the FBI and such, as if as if they were this sort of like, the expert on this issue you call on the phone and they have no stake in the matter. And in Waco, you had two parties in a standoff, and you had one party barring access, barring media access to the other party.
Right.
And so, but then you had a media who literally couldn't get to the story. They were kept miles away. And instead of, constantly writing, we have no idea what's happening because we're 2 miles away, FBI people say X, but we don't know, they would write, FBI people say X, therefore X is true.
Right.
There is this idea that they're a neutral source, which is incredibly dangerous.
That's what was in danger of happening in Ferguson a lot of the times, where just physical on-the-ground reporting, not necessarily even talking to protesters, because that was clearly allowed to happen. You could go down there during the day when the shit wasn't hitting the fan, but at night, when it was, if you weren't in the area where stuff was going down, then you weren't able to report on it. And luckily, look, I'm going to go down there and do that. But it kind of brings me to another thing that happened in Ferguson and has been happening elsewhere with all of these police-involved fatalities. So in Ferguson, you have the official source, right? And most police reporting is based on primary sources, which are always going to be the authorities, right? Police say, this guy tried to rob a gas station at this time, and he was taken into custody and charged with whatever. So that's the main mode of reporting. But then in Ferguson and a lot of other places, what you have is here's what the police say, and then here's what the citizens and the witnesses say. And a lot of times, more traditional legacy media outlets are going to go with the police source, and then they're not going to go and do the additional reporting of here's what people on the ground said. So obviously you have Mike Brown in Ferguson. You have Ezell Ford. Is his last name Ford? I can't remember. In L.A., the guy who was killed by the cops there in L.A.
I think so.
And then just on August 24th, you had two young kids in Chicago, Rashad McIntosh and Deshaun Pittman, who were both shot and killed by the cops. And so the cops have their side of the story, and then the witnesses have their side of the story. But a lot of times, and this is partly due to just staffing cuts and a lack of time for reporters, legacy media outlets are only going to report what police said and not necessarily what the community is saying, and what the community is saying is oftentimes opposite, which then is who's really looking into these police-involved deaths? In Chicago, you've had 176 police-involved shootings since 2007. The Independent Police Review Authority, which is investigates these, they've found wrongdoing in 3. So I
just want to. I think it's important to point out that the default position of reverence for police is not the default position among black people.
Right.
It's the default position among suburban New Jersey white idiots that I know.
Sean Hannity has never been harassed by police when he's been pulled over.
I bet Sean Hannity has been pulled over, but he accepts it as legitimate wielding of state power.
I'm sure he does.
One reason that another reason I brought up the Occupy parallel is because, when they would make arrests at Occupy, they would cite stuff like impeding pedestrian traffic,
failure to disperse,
obstruction of governmental action, failure to disperse, that kind of stuff. Mm. So that was ubiquitous in New York anyway. And that's sort of the same stuff that was cited as justification for arrests of both journalists and protesters in Ferguson, though obviously under the guidelines of whatever the Missouri statute is or whatever the local ordinance is there. So and then of course, so the NYPD does that, knowing that they're not going to get any convictions on those charges, because I think 99% of the Occupy arrests were tossed out by judges, which is actually remarkable and an undercovered aspect of that. So that they're able to conduct policing with impunity in that manner, knowing that they're just a nonsense arrest, but doing it anyway because they know they're never going to be held accountable. I think that kind of mindset maybe, I don't know, transposes onto Missouri. And I also want to add that the reverence for police thing is also a living issue when it comes to the arrests itself, which is taken as a mark of shame in a lot of cases, even if you did nothing wrong and the police wrongfully arrested you. So like, that's why I made sure to like express quote unquote solidarity with the journalists that were arrested, because even if it was thrown out, they're going to be sort of sullied by it among people who are going to like view them with suspicion now that they are the type of person who got arrested, right?
Right. Well, I think, okay, so you're talking about these arrests, these failure to disperse arrests that never result in any charges. Honestly, I think that a lot of times the agencies that are responsible for charging people and indicting people with crimes are probably working hand in hand with law enforcement, and they're saying, look, we're not going to charge this, but it doesn't matter because they probably see it as a necessary evil to clear the streets, which is the argument that cops always use and used in Ferguson to say, look, you guys are blocking the street, you're causing, a danger to the public. But there was one night, the first night that Ron Johnson and Missouri State Highway Patrol took over, where he was just like, we're going to let them do what they want. And it was like a party in the streets for like 7-8 hours, like people riding around on the tops of cars and like everybody going crazy. And it was like this moment of like just straight jubilation where the protesters like had this sense of like they won, they took the street, there was no cops to be seen at all. Like, I mean, it could have gone crazy. If somebody would have gotten hurt or if somebody popped off with a gun, it could have gone really bad, but it didn't happen all night. So I think that like argument of a necessary evil is flawed a little bit, because we did have that night of like complete peace where the cops didn't have to clear the streets, but I don't know.
Well, human beings can amass in a group without, chaos and horrible things going on. That's what the police want you to believe, that they're necessary in all circumstances to keep the peace. And I beg to differ. I always used to contrast.
Sorry.
The difference between I gotta throw my own firsthand stuff in here. The difference between what the cops did in Oakland, Pennsylvania, which is the night Obama was elected, compared to what they did to most of the Pitt students during the G20 summit. When Obama was elected, you had a lot of really obnoxious, naive college students, like a couple hundred of them, in the middle of the street, screaming, "Obama, Obama," running around, and I saw 5 cops standing ready for anything that may happen. They ran around. They sat all over the lawn of the Cathedral of Learning, which is a Pitt landmark thing. Contrasted that with G20, when out of the whole the 2-day summit thing, you had a couple of bad incidents. You had sort of the rowdy black bloc anarchists trying to make trouble, and there weren't even that many arrests when that occurred. The most G20 arrests happened on the day after the summit, when all of the political leaders were gone, and about 20 people were protesting the cops, and about like a couple hundred people were milling around wondering why there were 900 riots hanging out. And 150 people got arrested for being on their own campus in their own neighborhood. And, the streets were not nearly as blocked as they had been the night Obama was elected. And, I mean, come on, you had that police reaction to people being mad what authority figures were doing. And when then they were celebrating a brand new authority figure, there were 5 cops sitting on the sidelines letting them block the streets.
Because they had intelligence.
I feel like I need to say that I ran around screaming Obama that night too, because it was awesome that a black guy named Barack Hussein Obama was elected in a
I've heard the
landslide
Patton
over
Oswalt
John
skit, I know.
McCain. That was an awesome night, and I don't make any excuses for running around screaming Obama that night.
I don't make any excuses for you either.
Okay. Or I don't try to walk that back at all, is what I'm saying.
Well, you should. You're kicked out of radicalism. Get out.
I never assumed that label. So I want to point. So
you don't have any labels.
Hold on a second. So may I speak?
Yes, you may speak. Please go ahead.
So Justin mentioned a few times that the cops kind of portrayed it as a necessary evil to conduct the nonsense arrests. I think that might be actually a inapt descriptor, I don't think they view it as an evil, quote unquote. I think they view it as a justified exertion of their duly afforded powers.
Right.
So I remember thinking during Occupy New York how ridiculous it seemed that the #1 law enforcement priority apparently was to allow for the flow of vehicular traffic in Lower Manhattan. And if you have been to Lower Manhattan, you know that vehicular traffic is like 1% of all transport in that area. So the idea that like everybody's rights need to be infringed and there needs to be this like massive police effort to make sure the roads are free for vehicles was just ridiculous. I mean, most people in New York City hate cars, whether conservative or liberal, because they clog the place up, they cause noise pollution, etc. And yeah, I remember Bloomberg was saying, we have to make sure that cars can go down Broadway in Lower Manhattan. Nobody even drives in Lower Manhattan. I do sometimes because I'm nuts. But
that's
most
exactly
people
what they did in Ferguson. They did the same thing in Ferguson. They said, we need to keep the street clear on West Florissant Avenue, which was like the main boulevard where all these protests were happening. So like towards the end of it, they were even like, you can protest, but here's what they did. This was great. So they were like, you have to be off the street, right? Because we need to keep it open for traffic. So you can be on the sidewalks on either side of Florissant protesting, but you can't stand still because that wasn't allowed.
Right.
So you have protesters.
It's the same in New York. It was the same in New York.
Right. They were walking in like a mile-long oval that they had to keep moving in to continue their protest, and they did that like all night. So it was like one thing and then the other, and then the other. It was like, you can't do this. Then they would find another way to do it, and then the cops would find another way to try to prevent them to do it. It was really strange and bizarre to watch.
Yeah,
that's the old school picket line, right? I never realized that. You always see sort of either a real footage or a portrayal of people protesting in an urban. They're just going a little circle, and it had never occurred to me until I watched That Night in Ferguson. And I was like, oh yeah, that's why they're always going in their little circle with their signs.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, I remember just seeing the most ridiculous arrests on a constant basis, like, and it was always so incredibly arbitrary. It was just whoever the cops seemed annoyed by or like didn't like the look of, he grabbed out and arrested. I mean, there would be, and they would invent new ordinances like people sidewalk chalking, which was perfectly legal as I recall. People like standing still for too long. And it was just. So the policy was not that you get arrested if you obstruct pedestrian traffic. The policy, in effect, was you get arrested if the cop thinks you should be arrested because he doesn't like it. I mean, contempt of cop. Everybody knows that charge, right? Mm-hmm. But yeah, so I have like a transition that I kind of want to make to put this in a broader context. I don't know if you will allow me to do that.
Go for it.
Possibly.
Okay. So, like you mentioned early on that the focus now moved from Ferguson to the Middle East turmoil, right? Why are you sighing and rolling your eyes?
Because you asked for permission and then the other guest allowed you to do so.
Okay. So
I'm not a left libertarian. I'm into the hierarchy of me being the host and you people being the guests at my whims. Go on, Tracy. Okay. Share with the class.
So you noted early on in this I guess you call it a podcast that the main focus in the news cycle transitioned from Ferguson to Middle East, right?
Right.
So. A thought came to mind earlier today when I saw a piece on Reason by Lenore Skenazy. I think that's how you pronounce her name. The woman who writes about free-range children, kids. How there's parents are being criminalized for letting their kids play outside. Mm-hmm. So there was a case. She wrote about this case in Texas, I think, where a woman allowed her 8-year-old daughter and her 6-year-old son to go for a short walk within eyesight of their home to a bench. And then the girl walked home and the little boy decided to stay and play for a while. So, of course, a busybody neighbor picked him up and brought him home, which led to a police visit, child protective services, and so forth. It's just like a terror if you read this piece. It seems like reads like a satire.
I read it. It does,
And I feel like that needs to, like that stuff, along with Ferguson stuff, along with Occupy stuff, needs to be contextualized with U.S. foreign policy and militarism. Because when you have this idea that the entire nation is in this collective struggle against Islamic terror, or the Caliphate, or ISIS, Al Qaeda, communism, Stalin, whatever it is nowadays, right? It breeds this deference to authority, such that it becomes a collective delusion, and so so I feel like it's all inextricably linked. You can't separate this stuff because now we're being told that we need to be very fearful of ISIS. Chris Christie and Andrew Cuomo just had a joint press conference. By the way, I think this is a total tangent, but I'm almost positive that Andrew Cuomo has smoking gun evidence on Christie for Bridgegate and is like strategically dangling it over him. And they're probably both going to get indicted at some point, but Cuomo could like sink Christie if he really wanted to. But anyway, so those two idiots had a joint press conference yesterday where they basically said that Christie said New Jersey needs to. He didn't say this in these words, but he said New Jersey needs to be prepared for ISIS. Okay, so my grandparents' shore house in Long Beach Island needs to be prepared for ISIS. Are you fucking?
Damn right it does.
So, but like that kind of stuff transmutes into the populace and fosters this reverence for police, because now police are the ones who are getting MRAPs and tanks and all this crazy military equipment that everybody knows because we read Riley Balco. But
yes, we do.
But people don't really think of it in that context. So that's why I think it's important, since we're apparently like in the midst of a war right now. I feel like that's important to mention.
I think that there might be something to that, though I suppose to be contrary, I might argue that a lot of our wars in the past 10, 15 years have been, they haven't been the grand struggle that, I mean, there's no draft and there's not in theory, there's the grand struggle, fundamentalist Islam, like we're against it, they declared war on us, so we're fighting back, but because our military is so small and because mostly our wars are pretty ignorable, that's one reason why America tends to tolerate them. Well,
a small portion of the population has to actually engage.
Right. Oh, okay, right.
Thank you.
It's not a small military, though.
No, I realize this. But the conflicts compared to World War II or Vietnam or something are not as grand, and they're easier to ignore. And most people are not as affected by these wars. So, in some ways, that's what allows them to keep on going.
Right. So people don't.
We have a fresh new, sort of new threat in ISIS that we're all going to be terrified about. But if it keeps going, and how long before we get, people yawn and foreign policy isn't even on the news anymore, and then it goes back to the most inane of stories. And meanwhile, the fighting will continue because there's an attention span problem as well. It's not the grand struggle, I don't think, as much as terrifying people like David Brooks, tend to wish it was.
I think you're onto something with most people aren't affected by, are directly affected by military operations overseas in the same way that most people aren't affected, the majority of Americans aren't affected by the situation in Ferguson and within black communities across the country and poor and minority communities across the country. People don't care about crime until it comes to their neighborhood, and as long as they're consistently able to keep it out of their neighborhood and to not have to deal with it, then they're never going to have really any reason to care about what's going on in someone else's neighborhood until something like Ferguson happens, where all of a sudden they're seeing these images that just don't make sense to their mind. Like when I said it was surreal to be there and witnessing like kids in swim goggles and bandanas throwing rocks at cops like it was Gaza or something. I mean, most people, those were the images that hit the average American and was like, oh, well, now I care about what's happening in a neighborhood that's not my own, not because of the death of Mike Brown, not because of the systemic problems that the people in Ferguson face, as far as Radley Balco had like that huge piece about like all of the municipalities and the way that the judicial system keeps poor people down. They didn't care about it because of that. It was these haunting images. So I mean, most people don't care about wars overseas because most people don't fight in them, and most people don't care about crime in inner city and poor communities because most people don't live in them. So I guess that's maybe a bigger thing to take away from this.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned Gaza, even if it was only kind of parenthetically, because that was a facet of this as well. I mean, that was going on during Ferguson. So at the same time that the federal government was sending military armaments to Ferguson, broadly in the form of stuff they've sent through the Homeland Security Department for years, but also literally in terms of the National Guard troops, they were also sending Iron Dome money to Israel so they could continue bombing Gaza. And frankly, I was really annoyed with libertarians, including you, Lucy, no offense, during Gaza for not speaking up forcefully about it, with some admirable exceptions, including Jesse Walker. Because there's this weird tension where there are a lot of Christian libertarians who think that they need to support Israel. 500 children were killed in that thing. I mean, give me a break. The Congress sent over Iron Dome money almost unanimously, except for 8 congressmen who voted against it, including Justin Amash, who I laud constantly. But, it was shameful the way that the conservatives and many libertarians treated that issue.
Are you making a comparison between the plight of the people in Ferguson and the plight of people in Gaza? Because as someone who also made that comparison, prepare yourself for some pretty heavy commentary on that.
Oh, I'm ready for it. I've been dealing with NFL trolls for the past couple days.
Oh, you are. Well.
Oh, I also know, that makes me think, the same people who generally supported the Gaza assault / slaughter / whatever you want to call it, generally were the ones least likely to support the Ferguson people and likely to make excuses for Mike Brown's death, are also almost universally really hardcore football fans. So extrapolate from that what you will.
At this point, it's just a podcast to provoke as many angry reactions as possible, isn't it? I mean, that's what we're going for, some sort of trifecta.
I'm just saying.
So much. Okay, I don't want to spend this podcast defending my. I haven't written about that enough because I don't think I know enough about it. Stress that you don't get to kill people indiscriminately because a few of them are firing crappy rockets in your general direction. Many people did disagree with me on that, including libertarians, and it was extremely disappointing. People think you get to. I mean, if we want comparisons to Ferguson, obviously it's more life and death for more people in somewhere like Gaza. But if you have a crowd of people, who are angry at Mike Brown's death, and there's 200 of them, and 10 of them are throwing rocks. Do you get to violate the right to protest 90 people? And in Gaza, if you have a couple of people firing rockets, do you get to violate the right to be alive of a couple thousand people in Gaza in response to that? I would argue no, you do not. But people disagree because they don't care about people's rights or lives nearly as much as I would like them to.
Would the cops in Ferguson, though, have even responded that way if they didn't have access to that type of weapon, maybe not weaponry, but that type of equipment? I mean, where I guess that's maybe something that is a larger question that people should be asking is, if Ferguson happened 15 years ago, before there was this federal program that was dumping all of this military-style equipment on cops, would anything like that have even happened? I think you have to say no, because I don't think they would even have access to that type of stuff.
There was some rough crowd control stuff, again, since the 60s, as people have pointed out, has been bad. But obviously in the 60s, sometimes they had live ammo and the National Guard and 4 dead in Ohio and that sort of thing.
And the 1999 Seattle anti-globalization protest is is thought of as the precursor to this, because as the libertarian press frequently reports, the police chief Norm Stamper has said that was the greatest regret of his career, to basically attack nonviolent protesters and cause a riot. So that predated 9/11. I think the better starting point, if you're going to select one, is probably the '94 crime bill, which the Democrats supported and which Joe Biden said did not go far enough. I also before I forget, I want to note something. So I'm often in New Jersey, and I grew up in this suburban northern New Jersey town. And I was walking down the street, last week I think, and I just noticed that there were just cop cars coming every minute down the street. It was like 11 a.m. on a weekday. I'm like, what is going on here? there were this is a town of like, I don't know, 12,000 or something. And it seemed like the place was just swarming with cops. It was a beautiful day, so I guess they all wanted to be out.
Mm.
But, they're just blanketing this town for no reason, other than to write tickets. But it was just unbelievable. It was getting to the point that I was getting literally angry and was like, had to like calm myself down. I was going to yell at a cop or something. Because there were like the municipal cops, so like the local police department, regular cops. I saw cops from a neighboring town, which I don't see often, driving, and I saw New Jersey State Police like zooming past, and it was like every couple steps. I had no idea what was going on. So like that's a form of Ferguson was the most egregious, like an extreme manifestation of this, obviously. But I feel like the mindset is seeping out such that we now accept on a sunny, late summer day in a northern New Jersey suburb, there needs to just be this major police presence for no reason.
Yeah. Accepting their presence so that they don't become, they become invisible because they're
And by the
there
way,
all the
these
time.
guys make like on average, I think, $130,000 a year. The police chief, listen to this. The police chief of Carlsbad, New Jersey, which in Carlsbad is in Hudson County, Bergen County, I think. It's like in the Meadowlands area where the Giants Stadium is and where like the Super Bowl was held. Carlsbad, New Jersey, the police chief, he has been on the job since 1978, so of course he accrues like a raise every year. The guy makes more money, literally, per year than John Boehner.
Well, I don't know who deserves it less.
Well, the Speaker of the House of Representatives makes less money than the police chief of this podunk, stupid little town in New Jersey that no one cares about.
That's not the case, though, for for like larger municipalities. I don't know what the only thing that I have to go off of. I wrote about a cop in Chicago that's been the subject of several lawsuits, and he's like a high-level commander within the administration. He's been a cop for 28 years in the Chicago Police Department, and he makes like $124,000 a year, and he's pretty high up there. So that would tell me that the entry-level, beat walking cop is probably not pushing much more than $50,000 a year, and obviously Chicago's a pretty rough place.
Oh, no, that's absolutely true. And the irony in this situation, at least in New Jersey, where I've investigated it pretty extensively, is that in the places where cops are like theoretically most needed, like Newark and Camden being the most beleaguered city in the country, those cops make the least. Whereas the police in like upper middle class to upper class suburbs who sit around writing tickets all day and maybe responding to a high school drinking party make upwards of literally $200,000. The police chief in Carlsbad made $230,000 a year.
Just like teachers.
Well, this comes back to the whole. We could all radically yell abolish all the cops, but they exist, so ideally we want them to say respond if someone is about to be, raped or murdered, or there's some, kidnapping. The violent crimes and the things where people are in direct danger, you want a cop to respond. And I'm sure you guys know that you can't sue the cops for not responding. Courts have ruled that they don't have, unless they have made a deal with you, if you're an informant or something like that, they don't have an obligation to protect individuals. They have an obligation to protect society at large. So if you call them 6 times, because your house got broken into and then you get kidnapped and raped and murdered, there's nothing for your family to do about that. There's this, and that concerns me because there is this element of, if there is this situation where you want somebody with a gun, somebody you can dial the number of to come and do something when it really maybe does matter, and it's okay, you're not going to radical hell if you call the cops. They're not necessarily going to come. When you had the Rodney King riots, which were very, scary, and lots of bad things that were not okay happened to innocent people, but you had people taking over sections of Los Angeles, and the cops were too scared to go in there because the situation was too hot. It sort of seems like when the chips are down and when you might need a cop, per se, that they don't necessarily show up because they're busy writing those tickets so that they can make their quotas, and they're kicking in the weed dealer's door and that sort of thing.
Well, it seems in certain cases it's arbitrary. And again, going back to Ferguson, there was nights where they were like, oh, we need to clear the street. We're going to do whatever we need to do that. There was nights where they let the protesters have the street, and then there was one night where they literally just left the convenience store that Mike Brown was supposedly to have stolen these like boxes of cigars from. Like, I sat there and watched the cops drive away and leave it open to looters. So it seems really kind of arbitrary, like when and where they decide that they need to protect and serve, and there's like not really any oversight that like calls them out on that, other than maybe some media coverage.
Yeah, by the way, can I do
There's a lack of logic, it seems like, in a lot of their decisions. I mean, wait.
Can I just before I want to do a quick shout out to the Alex Jones InfoWars crew for their coverage from Ferguson, which was actually stellar.
I know, I watched that. It was really good. You're right.
It was unbelievable.
Except whenever there was problems with the live stream, I wouldn't put it past any of them to be like faking it, the live stream's going out. They're using their super weapon to disrupt our transmission. I mean, there's still an element of like, I don't necessarily trust like what will happen to you people, but they were actually doing a really good job.
Well, I mean, their logic doesn't make any sense, because the logic at its core is just preserve this institution so that people can keep making money as police and not be subject to scrutiny. I mean, I remember during Occupy, the most kind of palpable symbol of the culture of impunity that kind of ran roughshod over everybody was that. So like at one time I was so there was a big march. I don't know if you remember this, from Lower Manhattan up to Times Square on, I remember the date, October 15th, 2011.
Is that the Bridge Day?
No, this was later. The Bridge Day kind of like catalyzed it into like this crazy thing that no one thought it was going to become. But I think this was like the following week. And so I had been kind of like documenting people who I thought were cops but weren't identifying as such. And I had taken like at Zuccotti a photo of this guy who I was almost certain was a cop. And at one point, like, he tried to like block his face with a newspaper. It was like the most comical cartoon thing.
Well, either that or he thought you were a cop. I mean, sometimes it's comical.
So, but then, so on that march, I took another photo of him, and I asked him his name. At which point, he literally, and I'm not exaggerating this at all, he took me, and this was like probably a 60-year-old, very rotund guy shaped like a grape, who pushed me with his stomach into the wall on the sidewalk, public street, and basically threatened me with violence. And I had two witnesses who observed it, and I immediately got them on video recounting what happened. I can show you the video. I still have it. But I didn't get the incident on video because it just came out of nowhere.
Yeah.
So I was wondering, like, is this guy must be police, right? Or else he would be subject to arrest for this. This is an assault. And I crowdsourced, and I couldn't figure out who this guy was. So I crowdsourced it, and eventually I figured out that this guy his name was I'll tell you his name, Lieutenant Daniel Daniel J. Albano, Albano, of the NYPD Legal Affairs Department. This is the guy who crafts legal policy for the NYPD. He works in the top floor of the One Police Plaza. He crafts legal arguments to justify what the police can do. And that's very
disturbing.
And he assaulted me. I mean, I wasn't injured or anything, but he subjected me to force without consent.
Well, that sums it up, doesn't it? Just a bit. I mean, that sums it up. All right, y'all. All right.
How long have we been going here?
If you ask that, it'll take 10 more minutes off of our count. Okay, after all this, two questions, I guess. Is Ferguson going to make a difference to police policy? I mean, we already had someone doing a hearing on militarized police. It's as if our elected officials suddenly were like, oh, my goodness, all of this gear is being sent to police departments. Why didn't someone tell me? This is news to me, as if they couldn't have found it out themselves. So is that, will there be any difference in police? Will there be any changes, improvements, reforms? Is my first question. Let's stick with that. Do you guys have any hopes for reform in any way, thanks to Ferguson?
If there's going to be changes, they're going to be in the way that police respond to these situations. But again, going back to Bradley Balco's really super long and epic thing about the systemic problems that poor and minority communities face, I mean, that's the change that is going to be necessary to prevent these situations from occurring in the first place, because it wasn't just the death of Mike Brown, it was all of those things that were kind of bubbling under the surface, and then that's what kicked it into high gear. So, I mean, I think you probably will see reduced militarization and changes in response to crowd control, but we're not going to see any changes about the root problems.
Yeah, I have virtually zero. Yeah. I have almost no hope for any kind of reform. I mean, there are some welcome developments in terms of local jurisdictions and city councils and stuff saying, "Hey, send back your weaponry. We don't want it." Mm-hmm. But they're going to do that in Santa Cruz and Vermont or something. But that's not going to be widespread. And further, just as broad, even despite those isolated incidents of good developments, if the country is at war with ISIS for 3 years or whatever it is now, there's not going to be appetite for removing powers from police domestically. Yeah. I mean, there needs to be this in order for this to any kind of reform to happen. It would have to be during "quote unquote" peacetime, and even then it would be difficult. But while we're in a war fever, and while there's a beheading video coming out every 2 weeks, no, I don't see any chance that there's going to be any change.
So the cops will save us from ISIS. We got to make sure that they're there to save us from ISIS when they come. It's true.
And then also, while we're all distracted talking about this, the conversation about drone technology and how law enforcement utilizes that is kind of gone away too, which is another really disturbing thing.
Yeah, our drone dystopias are coming. Just give it a couple more years. All right. Well, here's another question then, though. The thing about police, I mean, I'm usually reminded of how many years ago, whatever years ago it was, when Shay Calvo, the mayor of that little Maryland suburb or Virginia suburb. His house, he was the recipient of one of those operations where somebody sends weed to an address, and he had no idea. But the cops intercepted that package, and they raided his house, and they shot his dogs. He's a white, middle-class dude. He was a politician. And the fact that that happened to him, it obviously didn't save the day or solve much of anything. It just made SWAT slightly accountable for a short period of time in his particular area. But it got more attention because he was a less ignorable type of guy.
Right.
And when that's the thing with victims of police, black males, there's this vague idea that, well, did he have a record, or what was he wearing? I mean, there's the subtext there. Back in the 90s, I would argue that Waco and Ruby Ridge and stuff, there's another type of person that is not trustworthy. You had the crazy right-wingers who must have deserved it. There's the homeless people who are crazy. Crazy people in general deserve it. There are all these people that must have done something to provoke this response, and unfortunately, it usually comes back to, for me, and even snotty college students. Occupy, just a bunch of jerky college students. G20, well, that was just a bunch of annoying Pitt students who always riot over football, so they all deserve to be tear gassed on their own campus. People deserve it for some reason, and until you get to the type of person who's a white politician who couldn't possibly have done something to actually provoke this, they didn't do any drugs. Drug users obviously deserve it. Unless you get to those people, it won't change.
It's a pretty narrow segment of the population, too.
I think that's a really good point, because that kind of feeds into a broader theme of what we're discussing here, which is that so let's say, so I'm a cool libertarian who likes vinyl records, right? And I'm against interventionist foreign policy, but I'm for it in this special case where ISIS is especially scary and they're starting a caliphate, or Hamas is especially dangerous to Israel. Therefore, I'm okay with the U.S. government transferring arms to Israel to bomb 500 children. I'm mostly against police crackdowns, but things got a little out of control and they had to help the business owners in Ferguson. So, this is a kind of mindset that pervades a lot of people who pose as these enlightened critics of state power, but really they just recognize that it's kind of incumbent upon them to take up that pose now, or else they look like monsters. But when in reality they have no they have no actual objection to these kind of exertions of force. They just kind of pretend they do because they don't want to be perceived as violent reactionaries, when that's just the core of what they're advocating, but they want to dress it up with oh, I'm cool.
All right, well, there's probably something to that, but to expand or not just criticize 4 unnamed people on Twitter that you're probably talking about, or 100 of them, I don't know. Here's the new question then. If there's usually a category person that doesn't count in their life or their freedom to assemble or talk or not be in jail, if that doesn't matter, how do you? We've had a very, very insular podcast because all of us have seen police behave poorly, and all of us agree that something is horribly, horribly wrong there. How does one convince both the unwashed masses and the intellectual people who keep failing, as Tracy has mentioned? Is simply talking about it incessantly, writing about it incessantly, is that going to do anything? Do we just keep doing that until we die?
I don't know if there's any way to convince people who like you were saying about, well, every time something bad happens to someone, then you have to break down what those people have done to deserve it. And apparently the people who don't deserve it are in such a narrow category that's going to take a hell of a lot of convincing on a whole lot of different subject matter to be able to tell people hey, maybe they didn't deserve it, because if they have any kind of criminal record, then they deserve SWAT kicking down their door for a minor weed possession charge. Then they're also a drug user, so then they also deserve it. And then there's myriad other things. So I don't know how you convince everyone that that's wrong, other than, like I said before, people don't necessarily care about issues until they directly affect them. So maybe what we should wish for is that cops just get more and more out of control, and then the more wealthy white politicians that get their doors kicked in by unwarranted SWAT raids, maybe the more that happens, and the more people will start paying attention to it.
I fear that might be true.
The only way to accomplish this, in my judgment, is to do the painstaking, incremental work of building a freaking rational society that's not constantly crippled by war propaganda and police worship. So that means, for example, boycotting the NFL. And I'm serious, because the NFL, think of what the kind of values that imbues in the public. It's okay to play a game where you bash each other's brains out and you cause literal brain damage, where the players are shooting themselves by age 50 and are vegetables. That's a big deal. I'm getting a lot of hate for this issue because it's real. It means not, for example, demonizing Tea Partiers because you're culturally dissimilar from them and you support gay marriage, and calling for police to crack down on them because you don't think they should assemble. It means viewing black people and black lives as legitimate lives. These black people were probably in this country before you were, if you're a white person. So it's just it's thinking of people who live in Gaza as actual humans rather than terrorists who are implicated in the crimes of a minority within Hamas who shoot rockets into civilian areas and don't hardly ever kill anybody. Those are actual humans. even though they're Muslims, although most of them probably aren't even devout Muslims at all. They're just like you are, meaning you were raised Catholic and you maybe went to church when you were little, but you don't believe in the transubstantiation. I mean, there has to be an expansion.
Pointing out that people are actual humans. I believe that probably is. To me, that's the key issue. Is that these people? There's some differences, but those people are exactly as human as you are. The Mexican immigrant shot, or not even immigrant, the Mexican dude on the other side of the border fence shot by the Border Patrol person is just as much a person as you are. So's the black guy in the hoodie. So's the gun-toting whomever sitting in Idaho. I mean, and so certainly is the drug user. And there's this like atrophied empathy that people like. Their sense of empathy is atrophied for these people because they're different than I am. And
yeah, and it also means not letting Ted Cruz get away with appearing before a concert of minority Christians facing genocide in the Middle East against ISIS, which as much as we want, as it's right, I think, to oppose a multi-year war effort in Iraq and Syria, we have to acknowledge that this ISIS group is absolutely vicious. There could be reasonable steps to take to mitigate the danger that they're posing to people. Because I mean, read some of the stuff of them like putting swords to old ladies' necks and demanding they convert from the religion that they've held to their entire lives. I mean, this is insane stuff. You have to. I actually lost my train of thought there, but I think you see where I'm going.
Ted Cruz.
ISIS bad.
Ted Cruz, right? Ted Cruz.
Bad.
So it means not letting Ted Cruz get away with that stunt, which he probably will, and will probably win the GOP 2016 nomination, as I predicted. But
no,
you can't let people who thrive on and build their political careers on cruelty and dehumanization get away with it, which is
that's literally almost everyone in politics.
And I'm thankful that these tradcons, as they call themselves, traditional Catholics, mostly conservatives, are going after Cruz.
Literally never heard that in my life. I must have blocked it out.
Roman Catholics who reject Vatican II.
Oh,
I don't want to get into a whole discourse of things.
Let's not get into Vatican II right now.
Yeah. So I mean, but so they've been going after Ted Cruz, but I want to tell them, for example, that hey, I agree with you about this Ted Cruz stunt, and I hate the genocide of Christians in the Middle East. But where were you when 500 children were killed in Gaza? I mean, why is it only your co-religionists who warrant your empathy? So there has to be just
the acceptability of war casualties is a whole other thing. That most people believe in the acceptability of casualties of war. They do.
So there has to be a broadening of the sphere of empathy to include people who even you might not think who are again culturally dissimilar to you, but are still humans.
That I suppose we could leave it on that. That's pretty good. All right, real quick, kids, promote your works, and where to find them, and what you're working on next or recently. Briefly, Tracy, you go first.
Oh, okay. I think my Twitter handle is on my little thingy on the screen, right?
Yes, it is.
At mtracy, Tracy with an E. Always get confused with this guy Mark Tracy, who does not have an E in his name. Public. I am not that guy. And what am I working on now? I'm writing a thing actually on Scottish independence. Vote yes if you're in Scotland. And hold on, I don't presume to lecture the Scots on how to vote. However, if I were a Scot, I would certainly be voting yes. And I would be on the streets waving placards to that effect. Because I think that the Scottish independence movement is a huge momentous event that's being obscured now by this Middle East stuff, ironically. But it's gonna have an effect on Catalonia independence in Spain, on Italian.
We're not talking about Catalonia independence right now.
Okay, I'm 30 seconds more, and it could even bleed out into America, where you have Hawaii independence, Puerto Rico independence, Vermont independence, God willing, where I will move.
Free Vermont.
The Second Vermont Republic has to happen, or else we're screwed.
I'm so ready. I'm ready.
So that's what I'm writing on a thing having to do with that. That wasn't even good. Not even
good at promoting yourself. You just said you're writing about Scotland for somewhere.
What else should I say?
I don't know. You write lots of things for places. Never mind. You're done. All right, Justin.
I have nothing else to add.
Fine, good. Justin, where can the people read your works and such?
I write mainly for Vice and the Daily Beast. I also have a project going that will address issues of child welfare on a remote North Dakota Indian reservation that has been... There's been a lot of problems there with the child welfare system, and actually last week I just learned that a 1-year-old child died in some kind of car accident there. It's a strange and interesting situation, and one that's apparently a pretty dangerous environment for children. So I'm trying to keep tabs on that as best I can.
Okay. Speaking of people that got screwed
like a really
over,
great project.
Yeah, it does. I'm interested in that. People who get screwed over and not cared about in America can't do much better than Native Americans.
Yeah, no doubt.
That's for sure. So yeah, people should go. These gentlemen are fine writers, and you should read their works. Yeah, me. You can read my stuff at Vice and Anti-War and Rare and the Stag blog when I remember to update it. I was recently complaining about the Border Patrol, so conservatives are insulting me a little bit on Twitter, and that's fun. Man, this went on forever. Well, thank you, future audience, and briefly current audience, but not anymore. I think they all left because we were rambling. Yeah, Lucy Steigerwald, liberty.me, cops are bad. See you next time.
F the police!
Yes, thank you, Tracy. Hi, I'm Lucy Steigerwald for liberty.me, and this is Politics for People Who Hate Politics, and we're going to do a little chat about the po-pos, that is to say the police. And my guest today, pardon me as I fiddle with my audio and try to make things work, but they never ever do. Oh, Lord. Okay. You know what? Today we have our lovely guests. We have Michael Tracy, who is a reporter, and he has written for some quality publications like Vice, Reason, The American Conservative, and The Nation, and some less quality publications like Salon. We have Justin Glaw, who is a roving reporter person as well. I feel like Michael Tracy uses that term sometimes. And Justin has written for Vice, and he has done some Daily Beast stuff lately, particularly on the and about the big old mess in Ferguson. And I'm going to ask him about that. And we have at least the audio, I'm hoping, of Ed Krajewski. I can do it. Steigerwald's been butchered enough that I should be able to do that. And Ed is an associate editor for Reason 24/7 News, and he has done a lot of awesome stuff about the cops in the past 2 years or so. So welcome, gents. Thanks for coming.
Thanks. I think I'm here.
I believe you are as well. I think you're all here.
I like the fact that
Okay.
it's just a disembodied voice.
Yeah, we did that on the Paranoia podcast with Franklin Harris, and it kind of added to the atmosphere. It's not really as relevant here, sadly, but we'll work with it. There's an echo. This technical thing is driving me crazy today. I'm out of Hangouts practice here. All right, let's start with a little bit. Justin, I know you actually went down to Ferguson, and you wrote that up for the Daily Beast. Can you tell us what that was like for a minute or so? Just like, I don't know. Can you set the scene?
Yeah, it was totally surreal. Like the first night I got down there, I got there at the moment when it like popped off and cops were shooting tear gas canisters and rubber bullets, and it was just like really surreal to be in that environment and to think like this is a suburb of a Midwestern city and or something like that. So it was just very strange to be there and to like witness all of that happening.
Had you done any? I mean, you had done a Vice thing about the SWAT raid over the Twitter account of the
Yeah.
Noria, but had you, which
Yeah.
was an amazing and really disturbing, but
Yeah.
also funny, but also mostly disturbing. Had you done like, had you seen kind of what police can look like in America today before you got to Ferguson? Like, had you seen anything like that before?
Yeah, I mean, I've done crime reporting for two, like small and mid-market newspapers since like summer of 2011. So I mean, I've been on like standoff scenes. One particular one that lasted like 6 hours for this paper that I worked at up in northern Minnesota. So like I've seen cops in battle gear, like in camouflage with sniper rifles and MRAPs and all of that stuff. So it wasn't anything that was like super bizarre. It was just the level to which they had taken it and the amount, I guess. Like it's one thing when the stand-up situation in northern Minnesota was one thing where the guys got like a high-powered rifle
and suffered no consequences for it, despite like all the major newspapers and media outlets in the city authoring a letter to the NYPD in like really stern terms denouncing their conduct. So like even the New York Post was in on that letter, and there was never any accountability for it whatsoever. And of course, I'm not drawing a direct link between the NYPD conduct and the conduct in a suburb of St. Louis, but like it kind of contributes to the general zeitgeist of police just acting with total impunity. But I think the good that came out of Ferguson came from like the people, like generally the right-wing media despised Occupy, despite my best attempts to convince them that there were like libertarians involved and constitutionalists involved and so forth. And I goaded Ron Paul into supporting
Ron
it.
Paul was good on it. He started to try to reach out.
I was the first one to interview him about it.
Were you really?
Yeah, I'll send you the link. I interviewed him for a reason about it.
I legitimately do not remember that, which is really weird. I must have.
I'll send it to you.
Okay, yeah. I want to see that.
But so like the right-wing media complex despised Occupy, if you can recall. They did like rape slur. They like made up rape allegations about.
Dude, I stood a foot from Andrew Breitbart as he screamed at Occupy DC, "Stop raping people!"
Yeah, exactly. All that kind of stuff. But they couldn't really do that for the Ferguson protest because the grievance was so blindingly obvious, because it was largely black, meaning that there was more historic, like they couldn't dismiss it as like trust fund white hipsters.
Right. But they could dismiss it as looters.
That drew their attention to the overblown police response a little more forcefully, such that it couldn't be dismissed as this kind of willy-nilly idiot protest block that showed it.
He's clearly like presenting a danger to the community around him, and that's why they responded with the level of force that they did. But Ferguson was different in that the people were like armed with like water bottles, and they were responding with M14s and MRAPs. So.
Right, and if the body armor is not to protect you from water bottles being thrown at you, I'm not sure what it's for at all.
Right. Yeah.
I guess in general, we can ask the rest of you two as well. Ferguson kind of made you guys, all three of you, might have done some stuff about cops being absurd before Ferguson. But it definitely seemed like Ferguson, all of a sudden, the mainstream media at large discovered, oh my God, cops! Cops are a thing. I mean, you would turn on MSNBC in particular, and they were covering this for hours, for days, like a week there, I guess. Can we talk about the fact that this? And obviously it's leveled off since then, and it's not as it's not suddenly like the big story. Thanks, Middle Eastern shenanigans. But it's still like, do you think that it did some good in just getting more people to pay attention to like what the hell are the cops doing?
Yeah, so I want to make a point about this because I covered Occupy quite extensively, as you probably recall.
Mm-hmm.
in New York in particular, but elsewhere. And so, I feel like a lot of the groundwork, and I'm not setting Occupy as an arbitrary starting point for this, but I feel like a lot of the precedent in the terms of the police response to Occupy kind of contributed to what we saw manifest in Ferguson. In that, first of all, there was in New York, the police arrested journalists indiscriminately. So I think that is why the media response kind of manifested in the way it did, and MSNBC covered it a lot because they catered to African Americans, frankly, and
they were very good at it.
Yeah, it's a large segment of their viewership, and
I forgot
it was a
how
safe
non-awful MSNBC can be. Actually, when I saw them covering, I was like, oh yeah, you actually aren't an awful network sometimes.
No, Chris Hayes did a fantastic job covering it, as he usually
does.
He did,
yeah.
What was disturbing about it? I mean, Mike, I think you're right that they weren't that certain people with certain political views weren't able to like attach any kind of politics to the protesters in Ferguson, but they attached lots of other things to them. Lucy said something about, oh well, they just mentioned the looting more, which was something that was kind of
stress that.
Yeah, that was kind of like, I can't remember who was asking me about it, but I think I maybe went on. I went on somewhere where they were asking me about, it was probably Fox News, and I went on there and they were asking me about the looting, and I was like, look, this is kind of blown out of proportion. There was one night of looting. Yes, there was a gas station that was burned to the ground. Another business was, really looted. But I mean, it was pretty much contained to one night. But then that was for the naysayers, for the people who were saying, oh, screw these protesters, they're just like taking advantage of the situation. That was kind of like their clarion call that they used over and over again. Well, they're looting and they're rioting and they're causing unrest and they're causing these violent clashes with police. And that was another thing that became something that people were bringing up over and over again, was these violent clashes with police. And I don't think that, first off, I mean, I was there every single night except for one night where there was, tear gas and all that going back and forth. And it was very difficult each time to determine what exactly set it off. Like, it's not like there was one moment where a protester, like, threw a rock and then the cops are like, okay, we're going to